It was the kind of cold that made windows groan and trees crack. Snow had fallen through the night like powdered silence, blanketing the little mountain town of Pinnegrove in hushed white. Inside the Jenkins house, the fire had burned low, and the kettle was just beginning to rattle when the sound came. A knock, or something close to it. At first, no one moved. It was 6:12 in the morning, far too early for visitors, and far too strange a sound for a human hand. Mr. Jenkins looked up from his coffee with a puzzled frown. Mrs. Jenkins paused mid-step with a blanket in her arms. Their daughter Lily, still in her pajama onesie with sleepy eyes, tilted her head and whispered, "Did someone knock?" The sound came again, slow, soft, and irregular, more like scratching than knocking. Mr. Jenkins moved to the door cautiously, peeking through the side curtain. What he saw didn't make sense. At first, it looked like a mound of snow had slumped onto their porch. But then it shifted. He opened the door just a crack. A blast of icy air swept in, along with a sight he'd never forget. There, huddled right against the doorframe, was a bear. Not a full-grown grizzly, but a young one, maybe a year or two old. Its fur was matted with snow, ears tucked back, and its body trembled with cold so fierce it looked like it was shaking apart. The bear didn't roar, didn't move. It just looked up at him with the saddest, most exhausted eyes he'd ever seen. He didn't slam the door shut. He didn't call animal control. He just stared. Behind him, Mrs. Jenkins gasped. Lily stepped forward without hesitation. "He's scared," she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Mr. Jenkins turned slowly. "He's a bear." "But look at him," Lily insisted. "He's freezing." The three of them stood in silence, a family, and a wild animal divided by nothing but a thin wooden door and a moment no one had planned for. The bear didn't make a sound, didn't beg, didn't threaten. He just sat, shivering. For reasons they couldn't explain, no one moved to scare him off. It wasn't fear keeping them still. It was something else. Something that felt a lot like compassion, wrapped in snow. The cold seeped in through the open door, but no one moved to close it. Mr. Jenkins stood stiffly, one hand still gripping the doorknob, unsure whether to shut it or leave it open a second longer. Mrs. Jenkins held her breath, watching the bear for any sign of aggression. But he didn't growl. He didn't even blink fast. He just sat there, trembling, his breath forming shaky clouds in the morning air. Then Lily, all of 8 years old and barefoot on the hardwood floor, stepped forward. "Lily," her mother said softly, reaching out, "Don't." But Lily didn't stop. Instead, she turned and bolted to the living room. She came back holding her favorite purple scarf, the one with frayed edges and a glittery star sewn into one corner. Without saying a word, she gently opened the storm door and tossed the scarf onto the porch, just a few feet from where the bear sat. It fluttered down like a leaf, landing in the snow. The bear flinched at the motion, but didn't run. He lowered his head, sniffed the air, then, slowly, moved forward. All three of them watched in awe. The young bear, cautious but unafraid, shuffled toward the scarf. He sniffed it again. Then he did something none of them expected. He lay down on it. It wasn't much, a small square of fabric, with barely enough warmth for a child, let alone a bear. But he curled up anyway, resting his muzzle on top of it as if it were the finest blanket in the world. His shivers didn't stop entirely, but they softened. He closed his eyes. And the Jenkins family stood, completely still, watching a wild animal find peace in the quietest, most human way. Mrs. Jenkins slowly backed away from the door. "We should call someone," she whispered. "Animal control?" Mr. Jenkins asked. "No," she replied. "I mean, maybe, but not yet." Lily crouched near the window and peeked through the frost. "Can we let him stay just a little while? Just until he warms up?" Neither parent answered right away. Finally, Mr. Jenkins gave a quiet nod. "A little while." He closed the main door, but left it cracked just enough to hear if the bear moved. The family gathered at the window, peeking out like children spying on a dream. Outside, the scarf-covered bear slept soundly. Inside, no one said it out loud, but something had changed. The next morning, he was gone. The scarf lay crumpled where he had slept, a soft, purple reminder that the strange encounter hadn't been a dream. The porch was dusted with fresh snow, but his paw prints were still visible, faint trails leading back toward the woods. He left, Lily said quietly, staring out the frosted window with her chin on the sill. Probably for the best, Mr. Jenkins said, though even he didn't sound convinced. But the bear came back that night. Just as the family was finishing dinner, there was a faint rustle outside, barely more than a whisper. Lily ran to the window, heart thudding, and let out a gasp. "He's back." Mr. Jenkins opened the door slowly. The bear was there, sitting just as he had before, his fur still damp with melting snow, and his breath visible in the porch light. This time, he didn't wait for anyone to act. He curled up beside the scarf, like it was his own, and let out a soft, almost relieved exhale. That night, they left out an old quilt. Nothing fancy, just one from the attic, worn but warm. The bear didn't hesitate. He tugged it gently with his teeth, turned a few times like a dog settling in, and then lay down with a quiet grunt. It became a routine. Every evening, just before dusk, the bear would return. He never came too close, never made a sound. He simply claimed his corner of the porch like a quiet guest, sleeping through the night and vanishing before sunrise. The Jenkins family adjusted quickly. Mr. Jenkins moved the firewood stack to the opposite side of the porch to give him more space. Mrs. Jenkins started leaving out apples and berries in a shallow bowl. Foods she'd raid were safe for bears. Lily added one of her stuffed animals to the mix, a tiny polar bear she thought might make him feel less alone. Neighbors began to notice. First, it was the Winters family from 2 doors down, who spotted him one evening and nearly dropped a casserole in shock. Then came the mail carrier, who refused to approach the house until Mr. Jenkins explained. Word spread fast, and soon everyone in Pennygrove was talking about the porch bear. Most thought the story was adorable. Some worried it was dangerous. But every night, without fail, the bear returned, and the Jenkins family was always ready. Not with cages or fear, but with warmth. Days turned into weeks, and Barley, this is what they'd started calling him, became more than just a curious visitor. The Jenkins family grew accustomed to his quiet presence on the porch, and their evening routine now included checking on him, just as much as it involved dinner or the nightly news. But with each passing day, something about Barley seemed off. His behavior was too calm, too gentle, for a wild animal. He didn't act like other bears. He didn't scavenge. He didn't tear things apart. And every time the family ventured outside to check on him, he would look up at them with those same tired, soulful eyes. Those eyes. They never seemed wild, nor did they seem afraid. They looked lost, sad, even. His gaze was too knowing for an animal that was supposed to be hunting or roaming the mountains. Mrs. Jenkins began to wonder aloud if something had happened to him, something that had left him this way. He must have been separated from his family, she said one morning while setting out some berries on the porch. Maybe he's still looking for them. Mr. Jenkins, still unsure of what to make of their strange guest, nodded. He agreed that something wasn't quite right. Wild animals weren't supposed to act like this. They were supposed to keep their distance, not look to humans for comfort. Lily, however, was convinced that Barley wasn't just lost. He was searching for something, or maybe someone. Over the next few days, Lily began to observe Barley more closely. She noticed how he flinched every time a car drove past, how his body tensed when people walked too close to the house. It wasn't fear. It was something else. It was as though he was remembering something painful, a past he couldn't shake. One afternoon, Lily left a drawing on the porch for Barley. It was a picture of a bear, surrounded by a forest with a bright blue sky. She'd drawn the bear with a big smile, something she wished she could see on his face. The next morning, the drawing was gone. It didn't take long for the town to notice the family's new routine. People stopped by to snap pictures of the bear on the porch. Some offered advice, like keeping a safe distance from wild animals, but most simply marveled at how docile Barley was. Word spread beyond Pinnegrove, and soon the Jenkins family was receiving calls from wildlife experts, eager to learn more about this unusual bear. But even as they asked questions, one thing remained clear: Barley wasn't just a lost bear. He was a creature with a past that no one could yet understand. As Barley's visits continued, the town of Pinnegrove became more divided. The gentle bear on the Jenkins porch was no longer just a curious oddity. He was a symbol of something much bigger. Some residents thought it was a beautiful, once-in-a-lifetime story, an animal finding peace in the midst of a human world. Others saw it as a dangerous situation waiting to escalate. At first, it was just murmurs, people talking as they passed by the Jenkins house, worried but intrigued. But soon, the discussions became heated, and the phone calls began. A concerned citizen, Mr. Dawson, called the local animal control to express his concerns. "It's a wild animal," he insisted. "You can't just let it roam free. What if it becomes aggressive? What if it hurts someone?" Mrs. Jenkins received a handful of letters from other worried townspeople, each one asking the same question: what if the bear attacks? Some people even suggested that Barley might not be a young bear at all, but a troubled adult using the family's porch as a way to settle into the town, expecting handouts. For the first time, Mrs. Jenkins began to second-guess herself. Was she being naive? Was it safe to allow the bear to stay on their property, no matter how docile he seemed? She worried for her family, especially Lily, who had grown attached to the creature. The tipping point came when local wildlife experts weighed in. They'd been monitoring Barley's behavior for a few weeks now, and their professional opinion was clear: the bear was no longer a wild animal, at least not in the way people understood it. Something had happened to him, likely an injury or trauma, that had broken his instinct to fear humans. The experts recommended moving him to a sanctuary, where he could recover fully, away from people and the dangers of living in the town. The decision split the community down the middle. Some argued that Barley's presence was a rare blessing, something to be cherished. Others were adamant that he needed professional care, for both his safety and the safety of the town. The Jenkins family was left with a choice. They had taken care of Barley for weeks, offering him comfort in his time of need. But now they had to decide. Should they call the wildlife rescue and let go of the bear they had come to love, or risk letting things go on? The morning the wildlife rescue team arrived, the air felt heavier than usual, as if the entire town was holding its breath. The decision had been made. Barley needed help, and the Jenkins family had called the experts to take him to a sanctuary where he could recover fully. But despite their determination to do what was best for him, it didn't make the goodbye any easier. Barley had arrived that morning, just like always. He came quietly to the porch, his paw prints still visible in the snow, and he sat by his usual spot. He looked up at the house, as though he knew something was different. And as always, his eyes seemed to tell a story, one full of loss and longing. Lily was the first to notice him. She had been drawing inside, her crayons scattered across the kitchen table, but she stopped when she saw Barley sitting on the porch. She grabbed her coat and rushed out the door, her boots crunching through the fresh snow. Barley didn't get up when she approached. He didn't even flinch. He just sat there, waiting. "Are you leaving?" Lily asked softly, standing a few feet away from him. Her voice cracked slightly, and she blinked back tears. She had grown so fond of him, more than just a bear on the porch. To her, he was a friend, a silent companion who had taught her about kindness without expecting anything in return. Mr. Jenkins stood in the doorway, watching as the rescue team arrived. They were quiet and professional, moving with the ease of people who had done this many times before. One of the workers, A woman with a soft voice approached Barley slowly, talking to him in calm tones. The bear turned his head and looked at her, and for a moment the world seemed to stop. Lily stepped forward, placing her purple scarf gently over his back, the same scarf she had first used to comfort him when he arrived on their porch. "Goodbye, Barley," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The woman from the rescue team nodded toward the truck, and Barley, surprisingly, followed her without protest. It was as though he understood that this was the best thing for him, even though it hurt. As the team loaded Barley into the transport van, the Jenkins family stood on their porch, watching quietly. The van's engine roared to life, and Barley, now fully enclosed in the vehicle, looked back at them one last time. And then he was gone. Spring arrived in Pinnegrove with a softness that only seemed to make the town more alive. The snow melted, revealing patches of grass and soil, and the trees that had stood bare all winter began to bud with fresh leaves. Life seemed to return to the world in slow, steady movements, and with it came a sense of quiet healing for the Jenkins family. For weeks, Barley's absence was a constant ache. The porch felt emptier, and the house seemed quieter, as if the entire town missed the bear's gentle presence. Mrs. Jenkins found herself glancing out the window at the spot where Barley used to sleep, and Lily kept checking the door, hoping for a glimpse of him. The neighbors still asked about him, some joking that they missed their favorite porch resident. But the days stretched on, and the seasons changed, as they always did. Then, on a warm morning in early May, just as the first flowers of spring began to bloom, a shadow appeared near the edge of the forest. At first, Mrs. Jenkins thought it was a deer or perhaps a wandering dog, but as it stepped closer, her breath caught in her throat. There, standing just at the tree line, was Barley. He was different now. Vigor. His coat was fuller, healthier, and his eyes were no longer clouded with confusion or fear. He looked strong, stronger than when he had arrived on their porch all those months ago. But it wasn't just the change in his appearance that struck Mrs. Jenkins, it was the way he carried himself. There was a certain confidence in his steps, a quiet authority in the way he moved, as if he had found a new place in the world. Behind him, a smaller figure emerged from the forest, a bear cub, not much older than the one Barley had been when he first showed up. The cub paused for a moment, peering out from behind Barley's larger frame, its eyes wide with curiosity. Lily, who had been outside playing with a kite, gasped and dropped the string. She ran to the porch, eyes wide in disbelief. "It's him. It's Barley." Mr. Jenkins stepped outside to join her, his hand resting on her shoulder as they both watched in silence. Barley didn't approach the house. Instead, he stood at the edge of the trees, looking back at them one last time. The cub, too, glanced over its shoulder before turning to follow Barley into the woods. It was clear now. Barley wasn't just a lost bear. He had returned to where he belonged, and in doing so, he had brought with him a future. As the two bears disappeared into the forest, Lily turned to her father. "He came back. He's okay." And in that moment, it felt like the world had come full circle. The following weeks were quieter in Pinnegrove, though there was a new sense of peace that had settled in the air. The Jenkins family resumed their everyday routine, but something had shifted within them. They had seen Barley's journey from the confused, lost bear on their porch to the wild creature he was always meant to be. They understood now that some creatures, no matter how much they might seek comfort or help, still belong to the wild. Lily still visited the tree line often, looking for Barley and his new companion. She'd bring a handful of berries or apples, just in case, but she never expected him to return. She had learned the most important lesson of all. Love sometimes meant letting go, even when it was the hardest thing to do. One afternoon, Mrs. Jenkins sat on the porch, knitting a scarf for the upcoming winter. She thought about Barley and how, despite his brief stay in their lives, he had taught them all something profound. He had shown them that kindness didn't need to be a grand gesture. It could be as simple as offering a small piece of warmth to another being in need, whether human or animal. She heard the familiar sound of footsteps crunching in the snow and looked up. It wasn't Barley this time, but a visitor from town, Old Man Harris, the local historian. He had lived in Pinnegrove for decades and knew almost every story, every secret the town held. "I heard the bears came back," he said, his voice soft but full of wonder. He leaned on his cane, peering out at the forest beyond the house. "It's a rare thing, you know. A bear finding its way back to the wild. And that young one you all cared for, well, he's not so young anymore." Mrs. Jenkins smiled and nodded, a quiet sense of contentment filling her heart. "He's home then." Harris paused for a moment, his gaze shifting to the woods. "They say sometimes the world just knows when to let go, when to trust that what was lost will find its way back to where it belongs." The two of them stood there for a while, the breeze rustling the leaves as they both looked out toward the forest. The sound of birds chirping and the distant rustle of branches were the only sounds they needed. It was peaceful, and though Barley was gone, his presence would linger forever in their hearts. The bear had taught them the most precious lesson, that love and freedom were the greatest gifts they could offer, both to others and to themselves.